Hey everybody, welcome back to Something to Complain About. This is A. I'm here with
And I,
T. We are working on episode two, what, four handfuls and two middle fingers that we're calling this one, T?
yes, sir. Four handfuls and two middle fingers,
How you
otherwise
doing?
known as 22. I
Good.
am, I'm fine. I'm fine. I have spent the day editing some of our recordings, so I'm kind of over TNA today, but
That's
I'm
fair.
here. And too
Be-
much togetherness.
being a different,
Um,
adding to the togetherness.
yeah, there was a lot of togetherness going on. But otherwise, I mean, some I'm doing all right. We're working on episode 22 and we're mapping out the next several episodes. And again, I'm just always astounded that we are, we just keep going with this. I'm very proud of us. I'm
I'm
so
proud of us
proud.
too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Me too.
Huh?
Yeah. Sure.
So what are we talking about today? Hey.
Well, I think honestly, we're going to talk about boomers again. And I got to spend most of the last week with my boomer parents. Which, there were a few comments during that time that kind of made me think of some of our discussions. Um,
Mhm.
right. Like I have only one nephew and it took a
Mhm.
very long time for him to arrive on the scene. And so my parents are well into their 70s at this point, or it feels like they're well into their 70s. They would correct me because they're still early 70s, I suppose. But it took them a while to actually have grandkids, and so they're pretty excited about the one that they have, who's going to be 9 or 10 or something here pretty soon. Either way, the the thing that occurred to me as we were kind of talking about this, and you and I have talked about this before, so I know we were just going to turn it into an episode at some point. So I think that's where we're headed today. Is how parenting styles are so much different, right? Just even hearing them talk about how they did things differently with my brother and I than they are watching my brother and my sister-in-law do with my nephew. And you can see at moments it annoys them, right? Like they get kind of frustrated about it because it feels like they feel, I think, like they're being directed or instructed in how to be grandparents, some of that kind of stuff. But
Oh, yeah.
also, they in the same breath will recognize like things have changed. Everybody's learned more. So, like, we understand that's how they want to do it. And, that's how it is. And I think that is a kind of a source of maybe angst in our own generation, right? Like the way we were brought up, and then now seeing how some of our, what's the word? Co-Gen Xers, I'm not sure. Other, Gen Xers are now as parents, how they are raising their own kids. Just kind of being immersed in that for 5 whole days, getting to hear about some of that stuff kind of made me wonder, like, why is it so different? So I think that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, that sounds fine to me. It sounds fine to me. I
Even with all of the togetherness we've already had.
even even with all the togetherness, it does make me think a bit about that as you know, I have neither one of my parents and haven't for quite a while. But thinking back about how my mom parented us so differently than how my grandparents had parented her,
Yeah.
and some of the different values, I guess, that were reinforced
Mhm.
between how my grandparents did things and how my mom and her siblings did things. And I think what's really interesting is out of my mom and her siblings, I think everybody raised their children very differently.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that has to say about my grandparents' parenting skill. Um, that each one of the kids and no one really did what their parents did.
Yeah.
Um, But
That's
I
fair.
do remember those conversations coming up, and I remember, oh my goodness, like, especially when my cousins were starting to have families. And there were times that my grandmother, who at that time would have been, I think in her mid-70s, sometimes would just absolutely throw a fit. Because, like, for example, the way that one of my cousins, who is an educator, interacted with her 2-year-old was very different than how my grandmother interacted with her toddlers.
I'm sure.
And I know one thing that my grandmother would be, is like, "Why is she standing there talking to the 2-year-old? Just swat him on the butt and he'll learn." But my cousin, having more education and more knowledge in child development and, um, just the changes with the times, would talk with him when he was at an age appropriate level, gave him an age appropriate, I don't want to say punishment. What do I want to say?
Consequence?
As it was a consequence. And so just watching those kind of tensions
Yeah.
rise, it was very interesting. But I also remember my mom going off on her youngest sister and how she parented, and it was so different than how my mom did it. And I think for a large part, a lot of how someone acts as a parent is a direct result in response to how they were parented. At least I've seen that in my own family. And like there's some good things that do come through that get passed through from generation to generation. Like we were raised with manners. We were raised that education is important. We were raised that religion is important. I think that one might have kind of faith is important. The specific religion doesn't matter. So it should be important.
You were raised Catholic, yes?
Yes, I was raised Catholic. Yeah. But
And
it's interesting.
I was too.
Even with that though, I remember one time going through photos with my mom, and it was an old photo of like when she was a child, and she and her siblings, they're all kneeling in front of the Christmas tree. And I'm like, "Mom, what were you guys doing?" And she goes, "Oh, we had to pray the rosary before we got to open our Christmas presents." And then she
Wow.
goes, "Aren't you glad I didn't carry on that tradition?"
Yes.
Exactly.
My,
But
my mom was a convert, right? She was Lutheran. She grew up Lutheran, so she became Catholic when she married my dad. I'm not sure she could pray the rosary I'm not sure she could have prayed the rosary, but yeah.
yeah, so some of those things, but then there were, the work hard. My grandfather, for someone who was a World War II vet, was probably the most feminist in my family in that generation and prior generations, because he ensured that each of his daughters had some kind of formal training after high school and formal education after high school so that they would not ever have to be dependent on a man.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, yeah, so like my 2 older aunts went to a 4-year college, and then they were gone, and then nobody could afford to really send anybody else to a 4-year college. But one aunt went to like a business school for 1 year. My mom went to um, a 1-year LPN program, but he was very adamant that his daughters be able to go out and make their own way, which is very forward thinking when you think, my grandfather was born in 1920
Right.
and lived in rural Kansas. That's pretty
Yeah.
forward thinking. But I think some of that was from the perspective of his experiences
Mhm.
when he fought in World War II and going to Italy and entering cities and villages and farms where women had no source of income going in or out, and all the men were gone. And so I think that might have influenced that. Otherwise, I don't know where that came from.
Yeah,
I
that
think
makes
that's
sense.
where he saw the enlightenment, of like, no, my girls need um, to be able to support themselves. And then that was passed down to all the grandkids as well. He ended up having 9 granddaughters, and every single one of us, with the exception of one, has at least a bachelor's degree. I mean, I
Yeah.
win 'cause I have a doctorate, so
Yes.
but, not too shabby out of,
No.
9 granddaughters, and one was not able to go on. So it wasn't like my sister had a choice of going to college or not. She really didn't. She didn't have the ability or the capability. But 8 of us have at least a bachelor's degree, and I think half of the 8 we have a graduate. But I
Those are good
still
numbers.
win.
You
Those are
still
good
win.
numbers, aren't they? I still win.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it's interesting because like on my parents' side of the family, out of my dad's siblings, only one of them finished school. Right. So like dad started university, decided it was more important to like marry my mom and dropped out so that he could do that. I guess one of my uncles did a 1-year certificate in diesel mechanics.
Mhm.
So that counts. My aunts, all 3 of them, only one of them went. She did do, I remember my grandmother was always so proud because she did 2 degrees, right? She double majored. So she got 2 associate's degrees at the same time. But nobody really ended up going for a 4-year degree. On my mom's side, out of those 4 kids, both boys farmed. One
Mm.
was in the army, went to Korea during the Korean War, came back, farmed. The other one farmed as well, did not finish high school. And back then, right, so he would have been born in the late 40s, mid to late 40s. He was quite, school was very difficult for him. And they finally let him quit when he was 16 because that was when the state said, you didn't have to continue. It wasn't compulsory anymore, right? And I
Mhm.
just remember my, my grandmother was sort of just saying, like it wasn't worth the constant explosions. He would have behavioral issues related to school. And it wasn't until we
Well,
were
and
quite a bit older
he
that I think we realized he probably had an undiagnosed dyslexia and some type of learning disability.
I was gonna say that sounds like he had a learning difficulty, or learning disability. And that's one
Yeah,
thing too, the different intelligences, which could be a whole new episode. Yeah, because
or several. Yeah.
not everybody
He,
is the same way, but we all have talents, but we gotta tap into those.
and you could kind of see that play down into his family, right? Like I think for him, it was a sense of inadequacy to a point, right? Inferiority. So like
Mm,
when he got married, like his kids all went to school. Both of his daughters went to college. The son did not, but the son went to like a trade school, got a welding certificate. My mom and her sister both got bachelor's degrees. My mom did hers first. Like she went right out of high school, got her bachelor's degree. My aunt got married, had a bunch of kids, raised the kids, went back as the kids went to college. She went back to college. And that education piece of it was very important to my grandparents somehow because my grandmother had an 8th grade education. That was it. Grandpa had probably the same or maybe a little more. So they always
mhm.
wanted as
Well,
much education as possible. My mom, when she went back after her bachelor, she went back to get a second bachelor's when we were very young. They took us out of school the day she graduated so that we could watch her graduate.
mhm.
And somebody said to her, like, why would you take them out of school? And she and my dad both said, it's really important for them to see this happen. They need to see as young kids the importance of getting an education. So even when my
Well,
mom's really good friend got her doctorate in
mhm.
counseling, they took us up to watch her graduate because they wanted us to see that. So we went to
Well,
my
I
aunt's
remember,
graduation too.
well, and I remember like in my grandparents' house, they had my mom and all her siblings, like their high school, their senior photos, their
Yeah.
graduation photos. But then they also had everyone's when they completed whatever further training they were doing. And as a matter of fact, there were several photos taken of like my mom in her uniform because she'd gotten her LPN, my uh, nurse aunt who's an RN in her uniform, my uncle who's a dentist and his uniform. my my uncle and my dad, both who were in the military, were in their uniforms. So it was very much a place of that importance of
Mhm.
having uh, at least a skill or a vocation, if not, a 4-year degree, but it was the idea that you're going out and you're being productive. And so I think that's one thing I think that at least for us, was passed on through quite a few generations. That, and I was raised with just a lot of guilt in general. But I also heard a lot growing up, like our family did not come over here for you to sit on your ass.
Right. Yeah. No, no, I get it.
And, and I was probably like the last generation off the boat. That would work on, but
Right.
it was still living memory for my grandparents and a little bit for
Yeah.
my mom. So, yeah. So that can take you quite a ways too. That our family didn't give up everything and come over here and almost starved to death. That was the other piece. They come over here and almost starved to death and for you to sit on your ass.
Yeah. I heard something similar. I mean, my grandparents were all born in the United States, but their parents, none of them were born in the United States.
Right.
And so the discussions would always revolve around that. And I think that cast a very specific light as to how they went about raising their families, right? We're
Mhm.
just like grit it, take care of it, handle it. It's not particularly emotive. It's mostly just zip it and get to it,
Well,
right? We're not going to
and I
complain.
think,
We don't need to complain.
and I think, and I think that's typical of immigrant families, no matter where they're from.
Yeah.
It is the importance on education and training and the support. And then I think too, like the children who were born here or they were really little and then they came here, they actually see how much their parents worked. And I know like for my grandmother, that was a big thing because her father was an immigrant who came over in his teens and she saw how much he worked and he struggled and trying to learn the language. And back then they didn't have English classes. So, is
Yeah.
whatever English he learned, he learned on his own. So I think she used a lot of that. And my grandfather did too. They both grew up in an immigrant community and all the struggles and the sacrifices and just the strength that the older generations had. But this also, as we're talking about this, it makes me think of an article that I came across that talks about, and let me get the phrasing right, dishonest harmony.
Yeah.
And it's, I guess, in a modern way, it would be kind of like fuck your feelings. That's sort of what it is.
Yes.
But the the whole concept of just talking about feelings and having the conversations about difficult feelings and having somebody actively listen to you and validate your feelings, but instead just kind of get over it.
Yeah.
You're not that
Well,
special.
you mentioned
And
didn't you mention the aunt a little bit ago who had more education and was talking to her toddler instead of spank your
yes, my
toddler and move
cousin.
on?
Yeah.
Cousin.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's this. dishonest harmony
Right.
kind of in a nutshell, right? Also, and like my brother does this too. And it's interesting to hear the way he says it when my nephew was even smaller. Cause like my parents would have been the same way. Like if he's screaming at you, you pop him one, right? You spank him, you
Mhm.
put him in the corner, you do whatever, right? You don't give him attention. Whereas my brother would just kind of crouch down next to my nephew and say, "You're having some feelings right now, aren't you? You need a minute?" And
Mhm.
give my nephew a little bit of time and then be like, "Okay, let's talk about what you're feeling. Because clearly you're having trouble putting this into words. Are you bad? Are you scared? Are you right?" So he kind of walks through so
Mhm.
that the nephew could figure out how to name it, right? Like, what was the feeling I'm feeling? And then have a conversation about, okay, and this isn't a complicated conversation. I hate to say the word
No.
conversation because these are kids and they're very quick. Like, okay, what can we do about it? Can you tell me? Or do you just need a few minutes to calm down? Because it's okay if you need a
Mhm.
few minutes to calm down. Whereas our parents probably wouldn't have. You would have gotten spanked and told to calm down in a, as you just so eloquently stated it, fuck your feelings kind of fashion, right? Like that would have been it. Whereas this next generation later, which my brother is 1980, 1980. So that's
Mhm.
cusp, right? Gen X, like older millennial. He's very much Gen X. Like his attitude is very much, he's probably more Gen X attitudinally than I am, if you want to make up a new word here. But just having I mean, his wife is an elementary teacher, so she's had a lot of
Mhm.
training in early childhood development. He really hasn't, but they did some very specific parenting classes before they even had the kid. And then after they had the
Mhm.
kid, and I was kind of shocked. I don't know why I was shocked, but I was kind of shocked they did that. But my mom would step back and be like, "Oh, yeah, we would have never done that with you guys. And you all turned out just fine." Right. In a manner of speaking, we probably turned out just fine, but maybe
So
not
how
completely.
emotionally expressive are we?
Well,
Well, but with
you've
that,
known me for going on almost 30 years. I'm not particularly emotionally expressive most of the time.
but I think with some of that though too, I mean, it does go back to, the understanding human development a bit better. It also, I think, ties into in previous generations were so focused on meeting basic needs. And I
That's
think in
also true.
Maslow's hierarchy
Yeah.
that um but yeah, I remember my grandmother sometimes just being beside herself with how like my cousins interacted with their children. And none of my cousins have raised sociopaths. So they did something right, like
Yeah.
that's that's kind of the baseline in our family.
The bar is somewhat
That's the wrong
low.
side. Yeah, well, that's actually my dad's side. But yeah, but I mean, I found it very interesting. And of course, like I was trained in Boys Town parenting and all
Me too.
that. So as I would sit there and observe, I'm like, no, Emma's doing what she's
And
supposed to.
as weird as it might sound, I used to teach the Boys Town parenting model.
Yeah, I used to too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a trained facilitator. Let that sink in.
I probably don't know. I don't know if my training clearly is not up to date, but I used to teach teachers how to implement the model in their classrooms.
Yep.
I
I
was in
used
charge of
I
teaching
used
our staff.
I used to teach the moms.
Yep.
Yeah. I used to teach parents.
Well, and interestingly, when some of my other friends started having kids, at least back when I lived in the big old, some of the friends that I had there as they were having kids, when those kids would get to be the age where you could interact with them a little bit differently than an infant, they would
Mhm.
ask me, "What would you do?" Right. And the thing that's weird about this, and maybe weird is also a bad word here, but like, so the degree that my sister in law has is this sort of same degree that my mom got. right? She got
Mhm.
an elementary education degree with sort of back then, I think they would have not called it a major, but it would have been like a specialization or something in early childhood
Mhm.
development, which is also what
Mhm.
my sister-in-law has. Just the time period, right? So my mom's initial university experience was secondary education. She went back for elementary education in the early 80s.
Mhm.
My sister-in-law got her degree in the early 2000s. Just in that 20-year period, the things that they learned, right, were
Mhm.
very, very different as far as how children developed, how they respond to instruction. And so that I think has played a significant role in how they interact with my nephew.
When I started working with my degree and I was in social work,
Yes.
and there was such a huge difference between, and like you could tell who had been educated, the old school at that time
Mhm.
were educated like in the 60s.
Yeah.
And you could tell just
Yeah.
by how someone would approach the problem
Yeah.
and what their default theory or whatever was. You could really tell when, and you could also tell who had continued learning and who just kind of froze in time.
Right. Yep.
Which
You
which now
could.
anymore, I don't think you can afford to do that so much anymore.
No.
But back then you could, where it could be, well, when I got my education and I got my BSW in 1982, this is how we did it, and that's how I do it. That stuff doesn't fly as much anymore. Sort of like, but if you're practicing now, then you probably should get up to your 2024 standards. It's
Yeah.
sort of like now I have, even though my undergrad and I did a lot of work in the field of psychology, I stay away from it now because I'm like, I, I learned DSM-4. I got some catching up to do.
Right.
So I don't even profess to have, because that education did stop 25 years ago, the straight up in college. And
Right. This disharmony, is that, am I saying that right?
yeah,
Dishonest harmony. I think this sort of filters down from not the silent, which is the greatest generation, right? It sort of filters down from them. You're talking about people who were born and then grew up during the Great Depression, right? So
mhm,
when you're talking about like Maslow's hierarchy here and that kind of stuff, they really were mostly concerned with, can we eat and do we have a roof over our heads?
right.
Because poverty was the thing, right? My grandfather
Well,
would talk about like how they would have extra fat, right? Extra shortening or pig fat that they'd rendered into lard. And they would soak the bread in lard so they'd get more energy out of the fat so they could keep doing the work they needed to do on the farm. Which
oh,
today we would be
that,
like, that's not a great way to do that. You should get more protein, but protein was expensive and they couldn't.
okay. So I told you about my grandmother's plum dumplings, right?
Yes, my grandmother made them too because
Yeah.
our grandmothers were both
Where,
Czech.
and, and grew up in the Great Depression. But
Yes.
for our listeners who are unaware, these are, plot your recipe cards and take some notes because this is some yumminess. But yeah, the entire plum, pit included, not skinned,
Mhm.
maybe washed.
You were going
And
to boil it
then
in fat. It didn't matter if it was washed.
the germs get
Sorry.
cooked up, right?
Right.
Rolled in dough, deep fat fried in
Yep.
lard.
Oh,
Then you had to hurry up and eat it because you took the melted lard, poured it over,
yep.
and then you hurried up and you grabbed some sugar and poured a shit ton of sugar on it. And,
Yep.
but you had to eat everything before the lard started to cool and became such a mess.
This is
Was that what
gross.
your grandmother made?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
It
because
was
we
my
never could
it was
figure
my grandfather's favorite thing, even into his last
out.
decade of life. Like, that's what
Oh,
he
yes.
wanted.
My great uncle Ernie, that's what he'd always ask when he'd come over to grandma's house. And she'd be like, well, come on over and we're going to have dumplings. And I'd be like,
Yeah, no, don't make me eat.
Brendan and I, we never could figure out, was it a Czech thing or was it a depression thing? But it must have been a Czech thing.
I wonder if it wasn't a Czech depression thing. Like,
Maybe.
my
But
mom's family all immigrated from what would be Ukraine now and East Germany.
oh,
They did not do that. Like, when my grandfather on my mom's side heard about the dumplings, he was like, that's too much. Like, to him,
did
it
you,
was just foreign.
did she come from Bohemia? Because that's
My
where my
grand
grandmother's family came from,
my
Bohemia.
dad's mom did, yeah. Well, her parents came from Bohemia.
Okay, so that must be a Bohemian thing.
It
But
must be.
no, it's my uncle Ernie, because that's my grandmother was full Bohemian. I thought of a very but isn't slanderous when you're slanderous against your own ethnicity? Is it?
Doubtful.
Which is
No.
I'm just thinking like my grandmother was the product of one bohunk meeting another bohunk in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Well,
No, here's the crazy part. My dad's parents, my dad's family, right? My grandfather's family was from what would have been considered Slovakia, right? So
how
not
yeah.
Bohemia. And then my grandmother's family was from Bohemia. Those people didn't generally like each other, but
Yeah.
my grandparents got together anyway,
Two
despite
very different
despite the problem.
ethnicities. My grandfather came from his family came from Moravia,
Mhm.
and they actually were very wealthy. They had been landowners. And my grandmother came from her family, both sides came from Bohemia and were very, very poor. So you can about imagine how that all went down.
Not well.
And my grandfather, what's interesting is even though they didn't have much money here in the States, but they had so much money and land in Moravia that they sold the land, and it was like 3 generations of family. They all up and moved, and then they all just outright bought land.
Mhm.
That my grandfather had some very, uh, almost aristocratic
Mhm.
how he carried himself and kinda how he was raised. And then my grandmother with all the she just from chaos and stuff. But, okay, so you know then what I'm talking about with those plum dumplings.
Yeah. Fat
Yeah.
bombs.
Are you, is your gorge rising? Because mine is just thinking about it. As a matter of fact, I used to torture my brother with, um, if you're not good, I'm gonna make you some of my grandma's plum dumplings. But I think the
Mm.
worst part was the timing, right? Because you didn't want that lard to even begin to start
Solidify.
cooling.
No,
Yeah.
you wanted it down because otherwise you had to chew it,
Yeah.
and you
But I
couldn't chew
understood
it.
why you couldn't chew it. And I remember, like, probably about the last time I ate it when I was in high school, and I only ate it because I had to, because again, you ate what was served to you. Like, never would I have ever dreamt of not eating something that was served to me, especially at my grandparents' house, but you ate it. You could sit there
Yeah.
and cry, and I did, but I remember being like 16 years old, and I just keep pouring sugar and more sugar.
Did you drink
And just
coffee with
cry.
yours?
I drank whatever I could get my hands on with
So
it, because it was a meal.
the trick that my grandfather taught me, I guess, if you want to think about it that way, he loved them, so this was not a problem for him. The rest of us had to choke them down. He he would just say, "Have the hot coffee. It will keep it melted while you swallow it." Right?
Oh,
Like,
sweet Lord. No, nobody
so
gave me any. No,
the problem here was if you were having a glass of milk or a glass of juice or something that was cold, it would start
no.
to cool down the bits of lard. This has got to be a super fun discussion for people to listen to. The the bits of lard that were still in your mouth, and then you'd suddenly get this chewy, funky, weird texture. that if you kept
Yeah.
up with the hot tea or the hot coffee, see, grandma didn't like coffee, so she would just make a cup of hot tea. And she never told us that's why she was drinking it, but grandpa was like, drink the hot stuff. It'll keep it going
Because you,
down easier. I'm like, oh,
and did
okay.
your family eat like that was the meal? Because that's what my grandma did. Like we didn't even get a side salad, nothing.
No,
That
nobody
was
had
the
side
meal.
salads back
Like
then.
this is
What
why
are you talking about? In the
you know what
Depression?
I mean? Like you couldn't even get a piece of bread or anything with it. I mean, it was like that's what you
Well,
got.
it's
You got
because
the
you
plum
had all the
dumpling,
dough.
and
You
here's
had all
your
the dough and the dumpling. You didn't need any bread. I
oh
mean,
man,
the
oh
thing that I
god,
thought was weird about it, and I still think is crazy, is that it was never served with meat. Like, I would have thought it
no,
would have been like, have a little
no,
bit of meat, but growing up, they didn't
no.
have meat. Meat was hard to
They
get.
didn't have
So
they didn't have meat, and they ate it because, of course, as you know, it just sits
makes you
like
feel full
lead
longer.
in your belly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then I wonder why we all have, you know, heart disease and diabetes. This is why I ate. I
Well, but here's what's crazy about that is none of my grandparents ever had heart disease or high cholesterol. I mean, my
well,
mom's dad did, but he
mine
was German, but my Bohemian grandparents did not.
mine did, but yeah, no. So we'll leave the recipe for listeners
Yeah, if
in the
anybody chooses to
description.
try it, let us know. But
Again, it's
we'll come
it's
back from the
super easy.
tangent. We departed on a little bit of a tangent there about that. But as we come back to the dishonest harmony question, right? You made a comment also about like you would eat what was given to you, right? Like that
Yes,
that was also
yes.
something that we grew up with, right? Our grandparents would have done that with our parents. Our parents definitely did that with us. Like I was crazy sensitive to onions for some reason. They would make me sick. They don't thankfully anymore, but they used to just make me really not feel well when I was a kid. And my parents thought I was just being picky because I would like split the onions out of my napkin and then throw it away later or whatever. But it was also sort of that fuck your feelings, right? Like, eat
All
it.
right,
This is what's for
you eat
dinner.
it.
I'm not a short order cook. But
Did
like
you?
my friends who have kids now, they're like, okay, well, here's the thing. If you don't want what we're making, you can make yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but you can't, where I'm not
Oh,
making you a separate meal, right? Or whatever, which is sort of an offshoot of that. But also, like, we were not allowed to do that. Like, if we didn't finish our dinner, even when we were kids, it would go in the fridge and
um,
we'd eat it the next meal, no matter what everybody else was eating. And that's not how my brother and sister in law do it with my nephew. And so my parents kind of sit back and they're like, don't really understand, but
but how does
they're
that?
kids, so we can't say anything. I'm like,
But it does affect relationships with the food, though, because then I
it
also
does.
got, and this might even just be like, because messed up family dynamics, but eat everything on your plate, but don't get fat. But make sure you eat
Right.
everything so you don't get too skinny, but don't get fat.
Right.
Or watch your weight, but eat everything on the plate because, and the big thing was with my grandfather, there's starving children in Africa.
Yep. I heard that too. But it was also
You
that they
know,
were starving children when they grew up, right? Like, we
that it
barely
was
had enough to
right.
eat. You should be grateful.
Well, and that is one of the most, I mean, basic things when you care for another being is to make sure they have enough food, right?
Yeah,
Like if you really care about something else that has a heartbeat, you want to make sure they're fed.
sure.
So again, yeah, Maslow again, but also that's just one of the most basic. But then to throw in, the psychological distress, but don't eat too much. Don't get yourself another plum dumpling.
And
Never.
I think this is also one of the things that I say to a lot of my Gen X clients and patients, right? Like, we have a lot of that disordered eating because of those
Mm,
situations. And what I generally see now is, and this actually makes me very happy because I have Gen X people who come see me and they're saying, look, I've got this daughter now who is going to be a teenager soon, and I do not want her to have the
Mhm.
same food issues that I clearly know I have, right? Like, how do I make sure that she's healthy and that she's not afraid of food, that we're not focused on the scale, that we're just focused on her being healthy? I'm
Mhm.
not necessarily the person to do those things, but I have colleagues who do that kind of work specifically. But I'm always impressed when those Gen Xers come and say, look, I know that our attitudes about food were passed down kind of badly. These are not good attitudes. I don't want my kids to have these attitudes. Right. So like that whole, it's sort of discombobulating, right? When you're sitting there thinking, I got to eat what's on my plate.
But here's one other thing, though, too. And this is one thing that I've noticed. We both grew up in the country
Yes.
and come from families who did hard manual labor on the farm.
Yeah.
You just ate a lot.
You did. Especially if you were out there helping.
For you ate high calorie, dense foods. And so
Yeah.
that was one thing that blew my mind, like when I moved to town and stuff. And because I was used to grown men who did manual labor and could eat and eat and eat, and they'd burn it all off. And then I enter a professional field, and I'm going out to business lunches, and grown men are eating salads.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, aren't you, and they're not eating any more than I am. Well, no, because you don't need to eat like that with, so some of that I think is that, again, that kind of situational piece
Mhm.
too, and socioeconomic piece that, yeah, like you don't need to eat as much. And some of it in that food insecurity. And then with that, when you move from being insecure with something to secure, a lot of times it's how you show your love. Similar with money,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
Um, but a lot of that is class based though, because even when you think of like um eating till you get stuffed, and
Right.
we had a lot of food, and think of some of the things that you heard growing up, like we ate good that night
Yeah.
or that day, or there was a
Yeah.
lot of food, or I ate so much I got stuffed.
Yeah.
Point of pride, huh, in working class and lower middle class. Whereas if we would have grown up in more professional um, families with a bit more money, we would have been talking about how good it tasted, right?
Oh,
But I grew up
probably.
in a family where the first thing we talked about was how much,
Mhm.
then we talked about whether or not it was good. But the most important thing was we had food.
Right.
It's good. But how many times did you hear like, oh, it wasn't that good, but I ate it anyway. I was hungry.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, so
that was a good portion of my childhood.
yeah,
I didn't like it, but I ate it because that's what we had.
yeah, pretty much.
I
That's
mean,
that's what
there
was
were
served.
definitely meals that my grandmother would make that I still wish to God I'd never had to eat. Like they were, she made this lasagna that she
Killing.
was always so proud of. And it really for us was a punishment because you could basically put it in a bowl. It was like noodle soup, but she would have this, I make the best lasagna in the world kind of,
Oh, that's how
bohemian complex.
my grandmother never um, made lasagna, but I remember one time we tried to make spaghetti, and we were already sitting at the table. This is how bad it was. We were already sitting at the table, and she had botched spaghetti. And I remember leaning towards my grandfather as she's starting to serve and going, you should have brought home an Italian bride so we could have some decent spaghetti. And he was just laughing. He goes, I know, I'm sorry. Any spaghetti I'd ever had before is since.
I've never seen anything
Never-
like it either,
No.
but it was
And that,
always her favorite and my uncle's favorite. And they would, she would specifically make
well,
it so for us if we were in trouble, like if we were out at the farm because we'd been mouth a call
Oh,
for something
oh,
and we're out there to like put up fence or clean the barn or something that was part of our consequence.
yeah.
She would know that and she knew we didn't like it, so she'd make it because you couldn't not eat it. You either ate what
Right.
grandma made or you didn't eat anything.
Well, see, and I think because at this point I was already like in high school or junior high. So I have a feeling somebody, more than likely either my brother or I, made a comment about can we have something other than what we usually get? And my mom made good spaghetti. So I don't know where mom got that skills, not from her mother. And so that, um, I mean, it was called spaghetti, was our punishment. But yeah,
It
my
was
grandpa
ours
was
too.
just laughing. My grandpa's laughing and apologizing. And then, of course, my grandmother's just going off in the kitchen. I'm not Italian. We know. Yes.
We can tell. Thank you very much. I mean, it's funny because the lasagna soup or whatever she made reminded me a lot of what Scandinavians would have called goulash, right? Like it would be noodles
Okay.
with burger with, but there
Oh,
was just
yeah.
too much liquid in it. Like it really would have been like goulash
Oh,
was
so
very
more of like a
thick,
soup.
but this was way more watery. So it was definitely more like a
Well,
soup. It was very
okay, but
weird.
I think it depends on the specific cuisine. But I have seen, I think, where goulash is more of like a soup.
Hmm.
Because I think it is originally like Hungarian. Um, I grew up eating a lot of goulash. But what I have found through the years is everybody makes goulash differently because part of the appeal is you can pretty much throw anything in it, kind of like a
Right.
casserole.
Right. You're
Yeah,
just throwing
you just
crap
throw
in
it
it.
through and what you have, and you call it good. Because I know my mom, she always made goulash. We loved it. She gave me the recipe. I would make it, then I would add and change some things. And so some
Mhm.
that's just, recipes. And a lot of times if someone doesn't know any better, I mean, like my poor grandpa, well, no, grandpa did know better because he had lived in Italy for 2.5 years. But we all knew better that night.
I bet you
So
did. I bet you did.
we kept our mouths shut, ate that flop.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, no, that's, I think our grandmothers probably we should do like a family tree. Wouldn't that be tripping if they were like cousins? That would explain so much.
It might.
We should. On my grandpa's side, he had an ancestor who they settled in North Dakota and then he just disappeared one winter day in a blizzard. So nobody knows if he actually just
Happens
like
more than you
walked out on
thought.
the if nobody knows if he like walked out on his family or if he died in the blizzard or what. One day he went out in the blizzard to check the cattle and then he just never came back.
That's
True
insane.
story.
But also not surprising given that in that time period in North Dakota, it was easy to do. I mean, it was even easy in when I was growing up, like when we would have to be out on the farm during blizzards, just for the fun of it, if we had to go out to the barn, they would literally, because it was at least 200 yards to the barn, they had a rope, a series
Oh,
of
for you
twine,
to
right?
follow. Yeah.
They would tie the rope and then they would tie one to you, right? So you'd have this belt thing around, they would just literally just tie it to your belt or to your snowsuit or whatever. So that way you were following one, but if for some reason you got, I mean, when you're a kid and the wind comes up, it can blow you off your feet pretty fast out there.
Well,
So
and I think, and I remember like yeah, I mean, I remember that like with my grandpa and stuff, but I think some of that might have been a holdover because, 50 years prior to that, Yuri went up to check on the cattle and he never came home.
right.
So
Yeah.
nobody knows.
I
Maybe
don't
he
know
was
why
living
they
a good
didn't think
life in Minneapolis.
they had rope back then too. I don't know why they didn't do it, but that's how we did it.
Well, I mean, I'm sure, I don't know. I mean, my grandpa's side of the family seemed kind of smart. The the idea was more that he used it as an opportunity to abandon his family. Seemed to be because, like, they never found a body.
Yeah. That's the strange part. They probably would have found a body because the snow would have melted at
Yeah.
some point.
So, I mean, I wish I could remember the story better, but it was just like, oh yeah, he wandered off and nobody ever saw him again. And they never found the body.
I don't know how you wander off though. If you're like out in the middle of the country,
I,
it's really hard to just wander off.
I don't know.
I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm just saying it's odd to me.
So,
I'm thinking of my grandparents' farms and thinking if I wandered off in the middle of a blizzard, we were 5 miles from town on a good day. Like at my dad's parents, we would
yeah,
have
but I
been
mean,
10,
he
12
could have
miles from
fallen.
town the other way.
He could have fallen into a well or a ravine. He could have been. His body could have been pecked away by birds. I mean, you don't know. Maybe she didn't look for him. Think about that. Maybe his wife was just like, good, he's gone.
Count my blessings while I can.
I'm moving back to Chicago. I hate these open plains. I mean, you don't know. I don't know how hard they were looking for him. See, there's so many
Fair.
unknowns. Why did he
Yeah.
leave? Why didn't he come back? How hard did she look? I mean, she might have only waited half an hour.
Well, but also like, if he would have come back a year later or 6 months later or 5 years later, that would have still been part of the story. So even if she didn't really wait to move on, if he would have come back, you would have all heard about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah. It's going to
It
be
was,
one of life's mysteries.
it's
I
just
mean,
kind of one of those
I was
things.
I was only told this story like once or twice because that was considered, I mean, even if he innocently died, it was still dishonorable for him to leave his family.
Sure.
So
Yeah. He should have picked a better time to die. He was trying to feed his cows, but he should have not done that. The cows were how the family got money, but he was just being selfish. It's amazing how hard we are on some people posthumously or whatever it might be, especially in our kinds of families.
There are,
But
sometimes I
this
walk away with more questions than answers. It's
most
like
often,
it's like the time, because I told you about my, well, I think it was both sides of the family when they tarred and feathered the German priest. And here's
yeah,
the excuse. He started talking about German things and they got tired of listening to it. So they tarred and feathered him and put him on the next train to Chicago.
why is everybody coming to Chicago? I just want to know.
I actually had a lot of family go through Chicago.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, I'm
And
sure
I
my family came through Chicago too. They would have had to get from the eastern seaboard to
yeah,
the
yeah.
Tools.
Because that's where all the trains came from, Chicago. And as a matter of fact, my grandmother had an aunt who lived in Cicero back in that day. But yeah, I don't even know what this episode's about anymore.
We had to get it to her. I was just going to wrap it back around and say, those are the kinds of stories, right, that
Right.
underlie the entire lack of emotion that got
Yes.
passed, right? When they were talking about, when we affectionately say, fuck your feelings, right? Like this is part of it. It's hard for us to completely, in the generations that come after us, to completely understand the things the greatest
Right.
generation, the silent generation, even some of the boomers, the things that they went through as kids, because most of us have never had to experience them. And so they're
Right.
not concerned with coddling your emotional outburst. They just need you to act right because that was what had to happen back then.
But listen to like what emotions and stuff, even just in the stories that we've talked about, some the emotional responses, some mockery, disdain,
Yes.
anger, some resentment, guilt, all of these negatives versus positive, and a lot of it emotion just based on the very limited bit of story that you get instead of digging deeper.
How much of that
Yeah.
do you think it's tied a little bit also to, you mentioned this at the beginning, somewhere at the beginning when we were talking about the differences in education, right? Like even just
Mhm.
education in the field, if you're talking about somebody with their social work degree from the 60s or whatever, or even like my mom's education degree versus my sister-in-law's education degree, there was a long period of time, and I don't remember anymore how long, but like the theory, and in some ways this is still what we see our penal system built on. The theory was that you eliminate negative behavior by punishing it, right?
Right.
So we learned, and we taught this at Boys Town. I'm sure you did that too. And so for everybody out there who's listening to us who has no idea what we're talking about when we say Boys Town, I never had to think about it when we lived in the Big O because everybody knew what Boys Town was. Now, when I live in
Mhm.
Chicago, if I say Boys Town, people think something completely different than what I'm talking about. Um, but Boys Town started in the, probably, I think Father Flanagan was in even before the 20s, right? Or maybe in the 20s,
Yeah.
where he took in
20s, probably.
a bunch of boys. He was at the time, it was Father Flanagan's boys home. Took in a bunch of, homeless boys, for lack of a better word here. And it over the years grew into this massive youth care organization that does a ton of research, has a ton of
Mm.
training for people. When I was a part of the organization, I worked with kids from all over the country who had behavioral issues. So this would have been back in
Mhm.
my social work days. The theory that they pushed was a little bit different, right? Which was you eliminate negative behavior by focusing on positive behavior instead, right? So when people
That
do
positive
something
reinforcement, which
right,
is behaviorism. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
positively reinforce the positive things instead of punishing the negative things. You will eliminate the negative behavior faster if you just accelerate the positive behavior. So that was a very weird, when I first started getting trained in that model, it was, and I still remember this because I got a lot of feedback about it. Like you have to have, when you're working with those kids, they would add up your interactions with the kids
Mhm.
and say, you are supposed to average 10 positive interactions with these kids to every negative
Yeah.
interaction, right? That was the goal back then. This was a long time ago. And I would be like 3 to 1 instead of 10 to 1. Like, I'm sure that doesn't shock you even the slightest. But it was really hard for me initially to shift my focus because I came from a background where when you did something you weren't supposed to do, you got punished. And then you
Well,
got punished often enough, you just chose not to do it because you didn't want to get punished anymore. And so it was a different mindset for me. I wonder if that's not still part of why the generations before us and generation before that, there was certainly a Maslow's piece of it, I think, but there's also, I think, this piece of it where they really thought that if they ridiculed you or made fun of you or were, emotionally kind of demeaning to you, like they thought if they drove the negative aspect of it, you would not behave in certain ways. I'm not sure that that panned out well for them, but I think that may have also been part of the subconscious drive to do a lot of these things that our generations are now saying, yeah, we're not treating our kids like that. We're not going to do that because now we know differently.
a few things, and yeah, it is knowing differently. Boys Town parenting is just based on behaviorism and
Mhm.
positive reinforcement because punishment effectiveness does diminish over time as well.
Right.
And then you also see then you get punished and then you sneak around and figure out a way to keep doing the behavior so you don't get punished.
Yep.
Or you learn to lie or you learn wraparounds, right?
Yep.
Or you learn crippling fear.
You learn also, right. You
And
learn not
then
to get caught.
you avoid any stimulus that would lead to that.
Mhm.
Um, it does make me think too. I think some of it, and again, as we grow in wealth and comfort from generation to generation, a lot of that stuff was to build you up, to make you tough and resilient, though probably not in the most effective way. I remember years ago taking an anthropology class and comparing uh, parenting styles between cultures. And there
Mhm.
was one culture, was it like a Inuit culture that some of this stuff, and I think like the title of the article was like, "Who's your daddy?" That like kids and even the adults would, and this isn't recent, so nobody be like, "Oh, it's not that way anymore." This is probably, who knows, because it was 25 years ago when I learned it, and the book was probably 25 years old based on research done 25 years before that.
Yes.
But because people lived in such a tough environment near the Arctic Circle,
Mhm.
that they would constantly rib each other, harass each other. But that was the idea, was so that people become tough.
Yeah.
And I think that's what some of it is. Because I think about like when I was growing up, I don't know how many times I was called a ball baby.
Uh-huh.
Now,
Don't cry like
quit
a
being a ball
girl.
baby. Yeah. Quit. I was always a ball baby. Quit being a ball
Mhm.
baby.
Yeah.
Which then, well, what would I do in response? Cry even more.
Right.
So I think some of that, yeah, it's the world changes, our understandings change, and we just get more and more knowledge all the time. Just like when we're talking about just even the boomers not getting the grandkids that they want. The more you know, a lot of times the more
Yeah.
you feel, or the more thought you put into something. But I think one thing that I find kind of fascinating is that, and you and I have talked about this, and excuse me, we have seen this in some different Gen X media, where like our parents were the first parents with access to birth control,
Mhm.
with like reliable birth control. And yeah, I guess that might be an example of the tech was there, but we haven't had time to adjust the behaviors.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know how reliable it was because, and I think I shared this with you earlier this week, that the one thing my mom told me about birth control was to beware of going on antibiotics while you're on the pill, because that's how they ended up with my brother. So, which might explain a few things, but, something in the antibiotics interfered with the chemical hormones, and then 9 months later, my brother was born.
We still tell people that all the time. Women are told that every time they're given an antibiotic prescription, even if they're not on birth control, they're told, in case you are taking birth control, please understand you need at least 2 forms, because the antibiotic will make the oral contraceptive less effective.
Yeah, someone didn't tell my mom that in early 1978.
Wonder if they knew.
They might not have, because
They
the
might
pill
not
had
have
only been around, it had only been around for what, like 15 years or so.
Yeah, they might not have known. Or if they did, then yeah, somebody purchased seller. But
Or she chose to, you know,
she didn't
in
hear
the
that part.
law.
Yeah. You'd be surprised how many people don't hear certain things when you give them instructions in a clinical setting. You told me to do what?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's written down right here. Oh, I didn't see that. Yeah, that's pretty common.
Yeah, it is. So, or I mean, I could see, because my mom, she was a bit of a gambling woman. I could see her going, "Yeah, I only got 10 days supply of antibiotics. What could happen?"
And you all are 40 some years later, and it's still happening.
Yeah. And it's sort of like, that was enough information for me, like duly noted. If I don't want a duplicate of my brother, do not.
I mean, yeah, fair. The crazy thing is, as we talk about parenting styles, it's weird because I don't even know where contraceptives fit into parenting styles. I know we wanted to talk about it today, but we've already talked about the parenting styles for a while.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think that little comment I made probably just sums it up nicely. That,
it does.
even with the new Yeah, if you add it into new technology, new information, new part of the culture, it
Mhm.
often takes a while for behaviors to change, right?
For sure.
To where, so I think that's kind of where we can leave that. And then
Yes.
as we grow and we know better, we leave things behind like plum dumplings and grandma
Indeed, we do.
made lasagna and spaghetti,
Right.
but other things we carry forward, like the value
Right.
of education. So yeah.
Well, is that a good place to leave it for today?
Yeah, I'm still confused as to what this episode was about.
I think this episode was about dishonest harmony, right? How parenting,
Oh, who the hell
how our
knows?
generation, like all the different generations have different approaches to how they, I mean, we know they have different approaches to how they parent, right? I think the question
That's
here
just
that we were trying to like grapple with a little bit was like, is
the
there some
honesty.
entitlement, right? Do parents, like our parents, feel entitled to tell us how to parent? I mean, thankfully, I'm not a parent. So they haven't had to tell me
Yeah,
that.
I don't think I can answer that
Right.
because my mom was not a grandparent. I'm not a parent. So that might be topic for another conversation with somebody who does have children.
That's a good question for somebody who does have children.
Yeah.
Look for that in the future. Those of you who are listening to us, all two
If you're
handfuls of you.
still with us.
Yeah. Anyway, well,
Because I'm pretty sure I lost the plot early on.
so this has been a bit of a rambling exercise. We're just stream of consciousness, having a good old time. If you are still with us, we are grateful. If you fell off, we understand. Be sure to like and
Great.
subscribe. Let
We
your friends
recognize your
know.
feelings.
Yeah, we recognize that. Be sure to like and subscribe. Share with your friends. Get them to like and subscribe. That'd be fantastic. And I guess for today, I'm A, and that's
I'm G.
T, and we're signing off because we've had way too much togetherness already.